What if I told you that the most successful leadership strategy in human history wasn't created by a Fortune 500 CEO, military general, or political mastermind, but by a carpenter who recruited society's biggest failures? In just 3 years, Jesus took 12 ordinary men, including a tax collector, fisherman, and a political zealot, and turned them into the foundation of a movement that has influenced billions for over 2,000 years. Most people think this was divine intervention, but when you analyze the psychological principles Jesus used, you'll discover 3 hidden strategies that modern leaders still struggle to understand. These aren't religious concepts. They're pure human psychology that anyone can apply. The most shocking part, the principles are the complete opposite of what every leadership expert teaches today. If you're building any kind of team or movement, the 3 most powerful leadership methods in human history are hidden in plain sight. These 2,000-year-old weapons of influence will change everything you know about leadership. Here's what doesn't make sense about Jesus' recruitment strategy. He deliberately chose the worst possible candidates. Think about this for a moment. If you were starting the most important movement in human history, would you recruit a tax collector who was hated by everyone? A fisherman with anger management issues? A political extremist? A guy who would literally betray you for money? This is exactly what Jesus did. And it breaks every rule of modern leadership and team building. Harvard Business School teaches you to hire the best talent. Silicon Valley startups compete for top performers. Every recruitment strategy focuses on finding people with the right skills, experience, and track record. But Jesus did the opposite. He walked past the synagogue leaders, the successful merchants, the educated scribes, and the respected community members. Instead, he tapped a tax collector named Matthew, literally the most despised profession of that time. Imagine recruiting someone who works for the IRS, but even worse, because tax collectors were seen as traitors to their own people. He chose Peter, a fisherman so impulsive that he would cut off a soldier's ear in a moment of panic. He picked Simon the Zealot, essentially a first-century terrorist. He selected Thomas, who questioned everything and would become synonymous with doubt. And most bizarrely, he chose Judas, knowing full well this man would eventually betray him. Every leadership expert would call this insanity. You don't build a successful team by choosing people with obvious character flaws, zero relevant experience, and questionable loyalty. Yet this failed strategy created the most enduring movement in human history. What did Jesus see that we're missing? Why did he specifically target society's rejects instead of its successes? The answer lies in a psychological principle that modern science has only recently discovered. But it will completely change how you think about building any team or movement. The secret Jesus understood is called the transformation advantage, and it's based on a counterintuitive psychological principle. People who have failed publicly are often more moldable, grateful, and loyal than those who have succeeded privately. Here's why this works. When you recruit someone who's already successful, you're getting someone with a fixed mindset about their abilities and methods. They've succeeded before, so they think they know the right way to do things. They're harder to teach, more resistant to change, and more likely to leave when they find a better opportunity. But when you recruit someone who has failed or been rejected by society, you're getting someone with what psychologists call a growth mindset. They know their current approach isn't working, so they're desperate to learn new methods. They're grateful for the opportunity because no one else would take a chance on them. And they're intensely loyal because you saw potential in them when everyone else saw failure. Modern research backs this up. Studies show that people who've experienced significant setbacks are often more resilient, empathetic, and committed to new opportunities than those who've had smooth sailing. They've developed what researchers call post-traumatic growth, the ability to become stronger after difficult experiences. Jesus intuitively understood this principle 2,000 years before psychologists had a name for it. He wasn't recruiting the 12 disciples despite their flaws, he was recruiting them because of their flaws. Look at Peter, the denier. His public failure of denying Jesus 3 times during the crucifixion didn't disqualify him from leadership. It prepared him for it. That experience of failure and forgiveness made him uniquely qualified to lead a movement of imperfect people. He could relate to human weakness in a way that someone who had never failed couldn't. Matthew, the despised tax collector, brought unique insights into human nature and social dynamics that the religious elite couldn't offer. His experience as an outsider made him better at reaching other outsiders. Even Judas served a purpose in this psychological framework. His eventual betrayal became a powerful lesson for the remaining disciples about loyalty, forgiveness, and human nature. It prepared them for the reality that not everyone they would encounter would be trustworthy. The genius of this strategy is that it creates a team of people who are not just skilled, but emotionally invested in the mission's success. They're not there for personal gain or career advancement. They're there because they believe in something bigger than themselves, and they're grateful for the chance to be part of it. Think of team building like sculpting. When you choose marble that's already been partially carved by someone else, you're limited by their vision and their mistakes. But when you choose raw stone that others have rejected as worthless, you can sculpt exactly what you envision. Jesus was the master sculptor who saw Michelangelo's David in stones that everyone else thought were too flawed to use. He understood that broken people aren't damaged goods, they're premium raw material for transformation. This is why Jesus' recruitment strategy was so brilliant. He wasn't just building a team, he was building a specific type of team. He needed people who would be completely committed, utterly humble, and willing to sacrifice everything for the mission. You can't get that level of dedication from people who have other options. Successful people always have backup plans. Failed people go all in because they have nothing left to lose. When Peter, Matthew, and the others left their nets and tax booths to follow Jesus, they weren't making a calculated career move. They were betting everything on a vision that seemed impossible. The result? These failed recruits became the foundation of Christianity, outlasting the Roman Empire and every other movement of their time. They didn't just spread a message, they embodied a transformation that proved anyone could change. Modern leaders miss this principle because they're obsessed with avoiding risk. They want proven performers with perfect track records. But Jesus understood that the greatest transformations come from the greatest risks. He built his movement on people who had everything to prove and nothing to lose. This is the first principle of enduring influence. Don't recruit the successful, recruit the transformable. Find people who are hungry for change, grateful for opportunity, and ready to commit everything to a vision bigger than themselves. The next principle is even more counterintuitive, and it explains why Jesus' teaching method was the opposite of every modern training program. If this is exploding your mind, stop now and hit the subscribe button. Because what comes next will explode your view on leadership, and if you don't subscribe, the algorithm will hide my next secrets from you. Here's the second thing that makes no sense about Jesus' strategy. He taught his disciples almost everything through stories and parables instead of direct instruction. This breaks every rule of effective training and development. Think about how we train people today. We use clear step-by-step instructions. We create detailed manuals and procedures. We break down complex concepts into simple, actionable steps. We measure progress with tests and metrics. The corporate world spends billions on training programs that follow this logical, linear approach. But Jesus did the opposite. When people asked him direct questions, he told them stories. When they wanted clear answers, he gave them riddles. When they needed practical instruction, he painted word pictures about seeds, sheep, and servants. The disciples were constantly confused by this approach. They would ask Jesus privately, "Why do you speak to people in parables? Why don't you just tell them plainly what you mean?" It's the same frustration a modern employee would have if their boss answered every question with a metaphor. Even more confusing, Jesus would often tell stories that seemed to have multiple meanings or no clear meaning at all. He'd talk about a man who found a treasure and sold everything to buy the field, or a woman who lost a coin and turned her house upside down to find it. Then he'd walk away without explaining what these stories meant. This teaching method seems incredibly inefficient. If you only have 3 years to train 12 people to carry on the most important mission in history, wouldn't you want to be as clear and direct as possible? Wouldn't you create a systematic curriculum with measurable learning objectives? Jesus had access to the traditional teaching methods of his time. The rabbis used direct instruction, memorization, and debate. The Greek philosophers used logical reasoning and systematic argument. The Roman leaders used command and control communication. But Jesus rejected all of these proven methods in favor of storytelling. He taught through parables, metaphors, analogies, and experiences that often left his audience more confused than when they started. Yet somehow, this ineffective teaching method produced disciples who remembered and repeated his lessons for the rest of their lives. 2,000 years later, people still quote his parables and find new meaning in his stories. His indirect teaching method created more lasting impact than any direct instruction manual ever written. The genius behind Jesus' storytelling method lies in a psychological principle called active construction learning. This is something neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists have only recently understood, but it explains why parables are more powerful than direct instruction. Here's how it works. When someone tells you exactly what to think, your brain processes it passively. You might remember the information temporarily, but it doesn't become part of your deep understanding. You're essentially copying someone else's thoughts into your mental file system. But when someone tells you a story that requires you to figure out the meaning yourself, your brain has to actively construct the understanding. You have to make connections, draw conclusions, and create your own mental framework. This process of active construction creates much stronger neural pathways and longer-lasting memories. Think about the difference between being told "be generous" versus hearing the parable of the Good Samaritan. The direct command might influence your behavior temporarily, but the story creates a complete mental model of what generosity looks like in action. You remember the Samaritan stopping for the wounded man, paying for his care and promising to return. That visual story becomes a template you can apply to countless future situations. Jesus understood that transformation happens through insight, not instruction. When his disciples finally grasped the meaning of a parable, it wasn't because Jesus explained it to them. It was because they had an aha moment where they constructed the understanding themselves. These self-generated insights are far more powerful than any externally imposed lesson. Modern research confirms this principle. Studies show that people who are guided to discover solutions themselves are more committed to implementing those solutions than people who are simply told what to do. The process of figuring it out creates ownership of the idea. This is why Jesus' parables were often deliberately ambiguous. He wanted different people to find different levels of meaning based on their readiness to understand. A child might hear the story of the lost sheep and think about God's love. An adult might focus on the shepherd's dedication. A leader might contemplate the principles of going after those who are most at risk. The same story taught multiple lessons to multiple audiences, but each person had to actively engage with the narrative to extract their personal understanding. This created a kind of customized learning experience that no direct instruction could match. Jesus also understood that stories bypass intellectual resistance in a way that direct commands cannot. If he had told the Pharisees, "You're self-righteous hypocrites," they would have argued or dismissed him. Instead, he told them the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector praying in the temple. They had to engage with the story to understand its meaning, and by the time they realized it was about them, the lesson had already penetrated their defenses. Imagine teaching someone to swim. You could explain every stroke, describe the proper breathing technique, and show them videos of Olympic swimmers. But none of that would actually teach them to swim. They have to get in the water and figure out how to coordinate their movements through practice and experience. Jesus' parables worked the same way. He threw his disciples into the deep end of spiritual and moral understanding and let them figure out how to swim. He gave them just enough guidance to keep them from drowning, but forced them to develop their own understanding through active engagement. This is why his teaching was so much more effective than traditional instruction. When you tell someone how to think, you're doing the mental work for them. When you tell them a story and let them figure out what it means, you're building their capacity to think for themselves. The disciples didn't just learn Jesus' teachings, they learned how to think like Jesus. They developed the ability to see spiritual truths in everyday situations, to find moral lessons in simple stories, and to communicate complex ideas through accessible narratives. This is the second principle of enduring influence. Don't tell people what to think. Teach them how to think. Create learning experiences that require active participation and personal discovery. Use stories, metaphors, and experiences that allow people to construct their own understanding. When people discover insights for themselves, those insights become part of their identity. They don't just know the lesson, they own it. This is why Jesus' disciples could carry on his mission after he was gone. They hadn't just memorized his teachings, they had internalized his way of thinking. Modern leaders who master this principle create teams that can innovate and adapt without constant supervision. Instead of giving people fish, they teach people to fish. Instead of providing answers, they ask questions that lead to discovery. But there's a third principle that ties everything together, and it's the most powerful of all. It explains how Jesus turned 12 individuals into a self-replicating movement that could spread across the entire world. If you're watching this far, you are different from most people. Prove it. Hit that like now and subscribe. Because people like you deserve to know all the secrets I'll reveal in upcoming videos. Here's the third and most mysterious aspect of Jesus' strategy. He deliberately made himself replaceable. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive leadership principle of all, because it goes against every human instinct about power and control. Most leaders work to make themselves indispensable. They want to be the smartest person in the room, the final decision maker, the irreplaceable visionary. They build systems that depend on their constant presence and input. They create organizations that would collapse without them. But Jesus did the opposite. From the very beginning, he was preparing his disciples to carry on without him. He told them repeatedly that he would leave them, that they would have to continue the mission on their own, and that they would do even greater things than he had done. Think about how radical this is. Jesus was the founder, the visionary, the most charismatic and capable leader in the movement. He performed miracles, drew massive crowds, and had divine authority. If anyone had a reason to make himself indispensable, it was Jesus. Yet he consistently worked to transfer authority and responsibility to his disciples. He sent them out on missions without him. He let them make mistakes and learn from failure. He taught them to teach others. He gradually stepped back from being the center of attention and pushed them into leadership roles they didn't feel ready for. The ultimate expression of this principle was his crucifixion and departure. Most movements would collapse if their founder suddenly disappeared, but Jesus had so thoroughly prepared his disciples for leadership that his physical absence actually accelerated the movement's growth. This seems to violate every principle of organizational leadership. Business leaders who suddenly exit their companies often leave chaos behind. Political movements that lose their founding figures typically fragment and decline. Religious movements that lose their prophets usually split into competing factions. But Jesus created something different. He built a movement that became stronger after he left than it was while he was present. The disciples who had been confused and dependent while Jesus was with them became bold and effective leaders after he was gone. How is this possible? What did Jesus understand about leadership succession that modern leaders miss? The answer lies in a principle that challenges everything we think we know about building lasting influence and creating sustainable organizations. The secret behind Jesus' replaceable leadership strategy is what psychologists now call distributed competence. Instead of creating followers who depended on him, Jesus created leaders who could reproduce his methods and extend his influence far beyond what any single person could achieve. Here's the psychological principle. When people learn to depend on a leader's presence, they never develop their own leadership capabilities. But when they learn to embody a leader's principles, they become capable of independent action that remains consistent with the original vision. Jesus understood that movements die when they become dependent on personalities, but they become immortal when they become dependent on principles. So instead of building a movement around himself, he built a movement around transferable principles that anyone could learn and apply. Look at how this played out practically. While Jesus was with them, the disciples often failed at basic tasks. They couldn't cast out demons, they panicked in storms, they argued about who was greatest. They seemed completely incompetent without Jesus' direct intervention. But this apparent failure was actually part of the training process. Jesus was deliberately allowing them to struggle and fail while he was there to help them learn from their mistakes. He was building their problem-solving abilities. not their dependence on his problem-solving abilities. The genius of this approach is that it created what modern psychologists call self-efficacy, the belief that you can successfully handle challenges and achieve goals. When the disciples finally succeeded at difficult tasks, they had earned the confidence through their own effort and learning. After Jesus left, these same incompetent disciples became incredibly effective leaders. Peter, who had denied Jesus 3 times, became a bold preacher who converted thousands. Thomas, who had doubted the resurrection, became a missionary who carried the message to India. Paul, who had persecuted Christians, became the movement's greatest strategist and church planter. The transformation wasn't just in their skills, it was in their identity. They stopped seeing themselves as Jesus' followers and started seeing themselves as carriers of his mission. They internalized his methods so completely that they could adapt them to new situations and teach them to others. This is what created the exponential growth of Christianity. Instead of one leader trying to reach everyone directly, Jesus created a system where every converted person became a potential leader who could convert and train others. It was like a leadership multiplier that could scale infinitely. Modern research on organizational development confirms this principle. Companies that train leaders to develop other leaders far outperform companies that concentrate leadership development in a few key people. Movements that distribute authority and capability throughout their network are more resilient and adaptable than movements that depend on central control. Jesus didn't just build a great movement. He built a movement-generating system that could replicate itself across cultures, languages, and centuries. Think of the difference between a light bulb and a fire. A light bulb is brilliant and efficient, but when it burns out, the light dies with it. A fire is messier and less predictable, but it can spread to create countless other fires, each capable of starting new fires indefinitely. Most leaders try to be light bulbs, brilliant, central, indispensable sources of illumination. But Jesus chose to be a fire that could ignite other fires. He understood that sustainable influence comes not from being irreplaceable, but from making others capable of replacing you. This is why Christianity outlasted the Roman Empire, survived centuries of persecution, and spread to every corner of the globe. It wasn't dependent on any single leader or location. It was a self-replicating system where ordinary people could become extraordinary leaders by applying the same principles Jesus had taught his original disciples. The third principle of enduring influence is the most powerful. Don't build followers, build leaders. Don't create dependence, create competence. Don't try to be indispensable. Make yourself replaceable by people who can do what you do and teach others to do the same. When you master this principle, your influence becomes exponential instead of linear. Instead of being limited by your personal time and energy, your impact multiplies through every person you develop. Instead of building something that depends on you, you build something that can outlive you. Jesus proved that the ultimate expression of leadership is not creating a legacy that depends on your continued presence, but creating a legacy that becomes stronger in your absence. He transformed 12 ordinary people into leaders who could transform others, creating an endless chain of influence that continues to this day. This is the true secret of the most enduring movement in human history. It wasn't built on superior resources, political power, or marketing strategy. It was built on 3 psychological principles that anyone can apply: recruit the transformable, teach through discovery, and build multiplying leaders. These 3 principles, recruiting the transformable, teaching through discovery, and building multiplying leaders, work together to create movements that transcend their founders. Jesus didn't just change 12 people. He created a system for changing anyone. He proved that lasting influence comes not from being the smartest person in the room, but from making everyone else smarter. Whether you're building a business, leading a team, or starting a movement, these 2,000-year-old principles remain the most powerful tools for creating enduring transformation. The question isn't whether these methods work. History has already proven that. The question is whether you're willing to apply them. If these secrets exploded your mind, you need to see my next videos, but only if you hit that bell. Otherwise, you'll miss the most powerful secrets in history. What's your opinion on the ideas presented in this content? Leave in the comments. Send this revelation to that friend who has sharp perception. This analysis is speculative and based on historical and psychological interpretation of public information, not clinical diagnosis.